want to give special thanks to Dr. Scott Greiner with Virginia Tech. He'll be speaking with us tonight about lambing time management. It's a crucial topic, as some of you are probably starting lambing already, or it's going to happen in the near future. So I hope that you can pick up a few tips if you've been a shepherd for many years, and if you're new, I hope you learn lots of great things to prepare yourself for lambing the next couple months. A couple of housekeeping things. If you have any questions, if you're on Zoom, you can use the chat window or the question and answer window through Zoom, and I will share those questions with Scott. If you're on Facebook Live, you can comment on Facebook, and I will share them as well. I should note, if you're on Facebook and watching, there is a little bit of a delay, so it'll take a little bit for me to get to your questions. Last thing is there's just a couple of questions at the end of the webinar that the participants attending via Zoom, I ask you to look at those and share your comments with us about the webinar. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Greiner.
Thank you, Amanda, and very much appreciate the opportunity to join you tonight. Hopefully my audio is working fine, and if it's not, please send me a chat or something, and we'll get that corrected. But as you mentioned, Amanda, I think this is a timely topic. Amanda asked me before we started, I'm about a month away from lambing at our house, and I anticipate that several of you that have joined us this evening might be already lambing. Some of you perhaps are 2 to 3 months away. So we'll approach this kind of from that standpoint, in terms of some flexibility in terms of when your lambing season is, and also approach this with some flexibility, knowing that there's several folks from around the country that have joined us, so a little bit of a unique audience when we have the opportunity to do it in this fashion. I think there's lots of keys we can think about and visit about, and what I'd like to do over the course of the next 45 minutes or so is highlight some key items underneath each one of these things that I think we deem as kind of the keys to lambing season. And really, having a successful lambing season really started a long time ago, from the context of sheep production anyway, and that was at breeding time. And we'll talk some about that context relative to ram fertility, ewe ovulation, how many lambs are going to be born has already long been established way back at breeding time. And I think as we think about lambing season, for most of us as shepherds, that's the most exciting time of year. It probably, from a management standpoint, is the most important time of year in terms of our investment of time, labor, and resources. Because I think as you look through and you study the data that's out there, our profitability is directly hinged on how many lambs we have to sell or derive value from. Of course, an awful lot of that has to do with how many lambs are born, but secondary to that, not only how many are born, but how many of those lambs that are born are we able to save, and are we able to market in some fashion, regardless of what our marketing system is. If we're selling breeding stock, if we're selling club lambs, if we're a commercial producer, the number of lambs that we have to sell per ewe has an awful lot to do with our opportunity to turn a profit at the end of the year in our enterprise. So the breeding season, lambing season are both key to that. For many of us right now is pre-lambing, getting ready to lamb here in very short order in the next month to 6 weeks. And so pre-lambing ewe management is very, very important. We'll spend some time on that relative to nutrition and health, our facilities and our preparation ahead of the lambing season, and then obviously what we do in the lambing barn immediately prior to and during those lambs being born is ultimately very important. So we'll touch on each one of those this evening as we kind of work through this webinar. I'm going to start with nutrition, and not we're not going to delve terribly in depth, but I want to talk about some of the key components of nutrition as it relates to lambing season. And of course, ewe nutrient requirements are affected by four primary things, those being the age and weight of the ewe, the stage of production she's in, and what her level of production is. That's true for a pregnant ewe. It's true for a lactating ewe, are the two key times in terms of these nutrient requirements we think about. One thing I wanted to emphasize, and hopefully this slide does that. As we think about nutrition, there's a really key component of nutrition that comes into play really in late gestation. As we think about lambing time management, this late gestation ewe nutrition is critically important for several factors. But as you look at this slide, I've got four different things on here. I've got in the upper left is dry matter intake, which simply is a reflection of that ewe's appetite. And we can see as we move throughout the production cycle, as we get to that last month of gestation, month 5, as denoted by the red arrow, we see those ewes' appetites really begin to spike. And that's Mother Nature's way of saying that she's got a rapidly developing fetus or fetuses. She needs more intake and more nutrient requirements to do that, and fortunately her appetite goes up to do that. In the upper right's accrued protein. We can see that there's a slight bump. Really, protein doesn't jump a whole lot until we get into lactation, but there is a slight increase in protein requirement. So we look at the bottom left in terms of nutrient requirements. The biggest energy change as we think about early and mid gestation to late gestation is that ewe's need for energy. We commonly measure that in terms of TDN. There's other fashions to measure that, but she simply needs more energy. And so we've got supplement strategies. Perhaps we think about which of those hays that we have available to us to feed. We feed a little better hay as we move into late gestation and save the really nice high quality stuff for lactation, because that's where we see the big blip in terms of energy requirements as well as protein. When we get to the lower right and we think about minerals, calcium and phosphorus are represented in this slide, but we can think about other minerals as well. Things like selenium, zinc, and some of the micro minerals. There's also an increase in requirements. So that last 4 to 6 weeks, particularly that last 4 weeks, is critically important in terms of ewe nutrition as it relates to what her requirements are as we look at those and compare them to the various nutrient tables. This slide just gives maybe a little practical implications in terms of how those energy requirements change. The table here, I've listed the nutrient requirements of a ewe early in gestation versus a ewe that's in late gestation. And we see again reflected in that difference in dry matter intake. In other words, if we make more nutrients available and more feedstuffs available, she's simply going to eat more. So we'd expect those ewes to increase their hay consumption. If we're fortunate enough to be in a region of the country where we've got stockpiled forage, like here in Virginia, she's going to increase her appetite and consume more of that stockpiled forage. We need to keep that in mind as we're delivering hay on a limited basis, or if we're delivering feedstuffs and maybe live in a region of the country where we don't have quite as extended a grazing season, those ewes are going to require more feed. The reason they require more feed is that our energy requirement increases. As I talked about, a very, very small increase in protein and an increase in terms of her requirements for those minerals, calcium and phosphorus in particular. And we'll talk about the importance of calcium in just a little bit. Generally speaking, for most of us in most regions of the country, the limiting factor in late gestation is energy, okay? And it's not protein, as well as that increase in calcium requirement. And so at the bottom there, just some very simple examples of late gestation ewe nutrition, kind of some diets, 3.5 to 4 pounds of a medium quality hay, along with 1 pound to 1.5 pounds of a supplement. That might be straight corn. It might be a 10 to 12% corn concentrate, kind of a mixed ration that's available to you locally. Whatever is available in your region. If our hay is a little higher quality, we might be able to decrease that supplemental feed to 1 pound. And at this point, I'm not going to talk about it real specifically, but our ability to meet this used nutrient requirements, whether we're talking about late gestation or if we're talking about lactation, where it's even more ramped up, the knowledge of our hay quality is critically important. So I can't overemphasize the importance of you working with your local extension group, whether that's your county agent, perhaps your local feed store, taking your hay samples and getting those analyzed so you know exactly what the quality of your hay is. Because if our hay quality comes back and we've got hay that's 55% TDN, which is kind of a good moderate quality hay, in our region of the country, we had an extremely a dry summer. Hay's going to be pretty tight. Hay making season earlier in the summer was extremely wet. Lots of it didn't get made in a timely fashion. And so we've got a lot of what I'd call moderate to low quality hay that's out there. So understanding what our hay quality is and how we need to fortify that specifically to meet our energy requirements and our mineral requirements is really important. And the only way to do that really is to test those hay. Man, I see a chat come through about maybe the slides aren't coming through. Are we okay?
I think so. It's going through to Facebook. I haven't heard from anybody else that it wasn't working, so I'm wondering if it's poor internet connection.
Okay.
I think we're okay right now.
Good.
Yep.
All right. So we talked about the importance of late gestation nutrition. And the reason that's so important is that about 70% of the fetal growth happens in the last 4 to 6 weeks of gestation. During that time, that ewe, of course, is developing her udder and her mammary development. That's a critical time for that. Colostrum quality is impacted by nutrition that last month of gestation. And we know through various research that if we restrict nutrition during that latter part of gestation, we can compromise colostrum quality. And so the antibodies that are produced are not as viable. The nutrient density of that colostrum is not as valid. And so colostrum is affected. We know that lamb strength and vigor, along with birth weight, is affected that last month of gestation. So lamb strength and vigor, which relates an awful lot to birth weight, has an awful lot to do with lamb livability. And so that's critically important to us. And of course, we've got some metabolic diseases that we'll talk about briefly in just a moment that tend to affect us in late gestation. We want to avoid those. I thought I'd just share, there's been a fair amount of research done in this area, and we think about severe malnutrition or severe underfeeding, as little as 3 weeks can impact things. Or if we think about maybe ewes that are on the borderline in terms of their nutritional demands not being met, ewes that aren't terribly thin, but maybe that last 2 to 3 months of gestation, they're underfed slightly. Both of those can impact placental development. The placenta is a key thing, obviously, in terms of birth weights, which relates back to our lamb livability and survivability when they're born. So this last month of nutrition is critically important. A few words about ewe lambs. Due to the nutrient requirement differences between mature ewes and ewe lambs, or yearling ewes, if you will, those about to lamb for the first time, we want to keep them separately. Those yearling ewes or ewe lambs need to gain somewhere between 35 to 40 pounds during gestation. That accounts for that weight accumulation in terms of fetal growth, but it also accounts for those ewe lambs are still growing and developing themselves. They haven't reached their mature size and weight yet, and so we've got the increased nutrient demands by those females, not only to maintain their own growth, but the growth of their fetuses as well. Their calcium and phosphorus requirements are higher than mature ewes, and so mineral nutrition becomes critical. I recommend for our producers that they feed a fortified trace mineral salt year-round, and particularly during late gestation and lactation. For us, that means that mineral is fortified with added selenium because we're a very selenium short area of the country. Some of you on that are listening in don't face that quite as much. Those of you in the Midwest, for example, don't have the selenium issues that we have in our part of the world. So kind of understanding what natural mineral levels in terms of your forages and feedstuffs in your region of the country is equally important. Related to nutrition and monitoring that, really the key component to that is having a good handle in terms of where our sheep are at, particularly our ewe flock relative to body condition score, which is nothing more than a visual observation or estimation of the amount of body fat or fat reserves that those sheep have. Body condition scores range from 1 to 5. I've given you some examples on the bottom. I know we've got a Suffolk webinar tonight, so I'm going to apologize right up front. Not all my slides are black face sheep. Some of my good slides don't have black face sheep. They have other sheep, but you can get the point regardless. That ewe on the left is quite thin. She's a 1. That ewe on the right is quite fat. She's a 5. Both of those are probably sheep we want to avoid for obvious reasons, being too thin or on the verge of obese. We kind of want to target that middle in the 3 to 3.5 range. Those ewes that we'd like to say are in nice shape is kind of where we want them at throughout late gestation and heading into to lambing season. So the other critical thing relative to body condition and nutrition is that we, regardless of where those ewes are going into the last month of gestation, we want their energy balance to be positive during that last 4 to 6 weeks pre-lambing. And what I mean by that is we want those ewes to be increasing in body condition as opposed to maintaining or decreasing body weight. That's equally important for ewes that are fat versus as well as ewes that are thin. Obviously, those that are on the thin side, we'd like to flesh them up some. Those that are on the fat side, while we would like to see them a little leaner to be ideal, we can run into some serious metabolic problems if we restrict energy on these body condition 4 and 5 ewes during that last trimester of gestation. So key point in terms of body condition is think about this early. Think about it if we're lambing in January, we need to be thinking about this in September and October as opposed to right now, because we're not going to change body condition a great deal over the course of the next couple weeks. If you're lambing later in the spring, assess those ewes right now where they're at so you can design a nutritional program to get them to that body condition score 3 to 3.5 come lambing time. You have ample time to do that based on your lambing season. Okay.
I have a couple questions if I can jump in.
Yep.
Someone had asked if you can't get a fortified mineral in the area you live in and it's selenium deficient, do you recommend an injection or stay away?
So Derek, I think if ewes are on a selenium fortified mineral adequately throughout their production cycle, I would not provide supplemental selenium in the form of BOC or MUC to those ewes if they've been on that fortified mineral throughout their production cycle. We'll get to lambs in a minute. I think generally we recommend to go ahead and do the lambs at birth, but not the ewes.
Another question from Facebook. Many producers shear their ewes 30 to 40 days prior to lambing. Can you address the nutrition needs after shearing while carrying multiples?
Yeah, can I hold that just a minute, Amanda?
Yep,
I'm
sure,
coming.
Sure.
Yep. All right. Great question. Thank you. Both of those are good questions. Impacts of body condition. We've touched on some of these already, but for both fat and thin ewes, both of those ewes are more prone to pregnancy ketosis or pregnancy toxemia. And we'll talk more specifically about that in just a minute. Thin ewes are prone to small and weak lambs have trouble with livability and survivability and toughness. We talked about the colostrum issues in thin ewes, and ultimately ewes that are in poor body condition tend to be poor milk producers throughout the lactation. So even if we can get them on a higher plane of nutrition during lactation, if they go into they go into lambing season and lamb on the thin side, they're simply not going to be as productive from a milk production standpoint. Fat ewes have increased lambing difficulty. We know that fat ewes are more prone to prolapse, particularly vaginal prolapse, but also rectal prolapse. And of course, in some cases, it's cost us money to get them to that point, and so increased feed costs as well. To maybe just to further emphasize and share a little bit more, there's actually been some research done that looked at body condition score at lambing time, and a couple studies have related ewe body condition as the single most important determining factor in terms of lamb survival because of its effect on birth weight. The other thing that's critical, body condition also relates to that fetal development, as we talked about. Lambs have what we call brown adipose tissue. That brown adipose tissue is what they call upon at birth. They use that brown adipose tissue as an energy source. Ewes that are on the thin side or don't have adequate nutrition in late gestation produce lambs with very low to minimal levels of brown adipose tissue. Those lambs are born a little on the thin side. They don't have that brown adipose to be able to help regulate temperature, produce heat, maintain body temperature, and keep themselves healthy, particularly in those immediately at birth and shortly thereafter. So as we've kind of summarized and think about this, I spoke earlier in this a couple slides ago about thinking about where your ewes are at currently. Where are you at relative to your lambing season? And what might you need to do from a nutrition program to get those ewes to this target 3 to 3.5 come lambing time? And again, that will differ in each of your production environments based on where you're currently at, when you lamb, etc. At that time, as we think about body condition, I think it's also relevant to think about how did we get where we are. There's lots of reasons that ewes are thin. Obviously, lack of pasture resources, lack of rain, drought, those kind of things. It might be an issue with parasitism. It might be generally a nutrition problem. Those are kind of the big ones. We know the impacts that has in terms of lamb survivability. It also impacts us throughout their production cycle. Ewes that tend to be thin at weaning have a more difficult time maintaining or refurbishing that body condition to get them back in shape so they cycle on time and conceive and ovulate enough eggs to stay productive. There's lots of reasons that ewes are fat. Sometimes that's overfeeding during early and mid-gestation. Sometimes that's difficult to avoid. I know, being a native Midwesterner myself, a lot of ewes get turned on corn stalks. Obviously, there's corn on those corn stalks. Ewes like that, and they can maintain or add a lot of body condition in a hurry. And so sometimes they simply just get over-conditioned without us actually doing anything necessarily wrong. Some ewes that don't milk enough, perhaps they're easy fleshers, those kind of things, but they can equally be a challenge. I'm going to switch gears just a minute and talk a little bit about some management things. As we think about feeding ewes pre-lambing, bunk space is really important. That's important from the standpoint of making sure that each of those ewes gets their daily allotment of whatever supplement we might be feeding. Also, as those ewes get further along in gestation, if we tend to crowd them, we have increased risk of injury and perhaps causing them to go into labor early or causing undue abortions. We know that exercise has a positive influence on ewe health, also has a positive influence on ewes maintaining condition and appetite. and tends to promote healthier lambs at lambing time. We want to minimize stress as best we can. So avoid commingling different groups real close to lambing. Make sure our ewes have got adequate shelter from whatever environmental conditions they might be exposed to. Shearing, as was mentioned previously in the question, shearing is an excellent idea. So many folks shear a month to 6 weeks prior to lambing. Those of you that have never lambed ewes which have been shorn and are used to lambing ewes which are in full fleece, if you shear once, I promise you, you will never lamb ewes in the fleece again. Alternative to that is to crutch the ewes by simply shearing out around their udder and around their rear end to provide just a little more cleanliness in that area. So nutritional demands, if we relate to shearing, yes, if we shear, those ewes' energy requirements are going to go up slightly. How much they go up will depend on the environmental conditions that those ewes are prone to. In our region of the country, that's probably minimal. If you get to the Midwest, it's probably greater. I will say that sheep are actually pretty adaptive, and so in terms of maintaining body condition, once they get a chance to adjust to being shorn and having a short fleece, their body adjusts relatively quickly. But certainly, depending on our environmental conditions, we're going to make sure that we have adequate shelter, barn space, or what have you, should we elect to shear. So I don't have a specific answer to the question relative to the percentage increase in nutrient requirements of ewes that are in short fleece versus long fleece. That's probably the bigger impact is what's the outside body temperature or the effective temperature as opposed to whether the ewe is shorn or not. So I think that's a more critical factor in terms of nutrient requirements. So for example, if we're talking about ewes that are exposed to an average daily temperature of say 20 degrees, in the Midwest versus here in Virginia, where our average winter temperature this time of year is probably more like 35 or 40. That 20-degree difference has a much bigger impact on the nutritional requirement than does if that ewe is freshly shorn or if she's in full fleece. Vaccinations, CD&T pre-lambing, 4 to 6 weeks to immunize those ewes against overeating disease and tetanus. Those ewes will transfer that through their colostrum to those lambs if we do that in a timely fashion prior to lambing. Those of us in regions of the country where we have heavy parasite loads, keep in mind we have the periparturient rise, which is the natural rise in parasites activity at or around the time of lambing. And so we want to watch for parasites there. Lots of producers lambing in the winter utilize lambing time or shortly thereafter as a time to deworm, taking advantage of that periparturient rise and using that in a strategic parasite control program. Man, I see a couple questions relative to nutrition. I might take those real quick before we move on.
Yep. So the first question is, what do you think of using the Purina purple tubs?
Okay, so I think from a standpoint of nutrition, for all nutritional programs, I think the way to address that question is, number one, what are the nutrients that are needed in your program? What are the options in terms of delivering those nutrients? And thirdly, what is the cost per nutrient to provide that nutrition? Okay. In all of that, we all have to factor in based on the convenience and the practicality of doing that. From the standpoint, without having specific knowledge of an individual feeding program and what an individual producer needs, I don't know that I can't give a yes or no answer. I can say that that product certainly has is a quality product, and so how it fits in your nutritional program, the best way to answer that would be to think about those things we just discussed in terms of what your needs are. How does that fit into your management and time and resources, etc. And then what's the cost of that relative to other options which might provide a similar nutritional profile.
Okay, next question. Can you elaborate on lambing time deworming strategies? Does it include lambs?
Okay, no. So specifically there, I'm talking about the ewe. There's a phenomenon that ewes at or around the time of lambing or shortly after lambing, those dormant worms most of the time, Mother Nature, there's a biological signal that ewe lambs, and so those parasites become more active and they lay eggs, okay, in hopes that those eggs will be contaminate the environment and then be spread to lambs, okay? Generally speaking, we don't worry too much about lambs and parasites until they're at least 45 days old, because prior to that, nearly all their nutrition is from nursing the ewe. It's when they begin to graze that they begin to pick up parasites. And so again, this will largely depend on when you're lambing. Even myself, here in Virginia, lambing in January, I don't have to worry about parasites until spring and we have grass. So even our young lambs, they're not going to really be exposed to any of the parasites that we're concerned about, namely the homunculus worm.
Okay, another question. We currently vaccinate at 4 weeks and 8 weeks of age with CD&T. If we would vaccinate the ewes at 4 to 6 weeks before lambing, would you still vaccinate the lambs at 4 and 8 weeks?
Yes, I would. Correct. So that vaccinating the ewes pre-lambing will provide immunity through the colostrum to those newborn lambs. Okay. So early in their life, as those lambs begin to eat and get older, a good recommendation is to vaccinate those lambs for CD&T somewhere around 4 to 6 weeks, or somewhere around 2 to 4 weeks before we're going to wean them, and then do them again around weaning time. So as you presented that question, I'd say I would continue with that strategy as well.
Okay, just one more question. What about using soy hulls to replace all or some hay?
So soy hulls can be used to replace some hay. Soy hulls are, again, they're a highly digestible fiber and an excellent feed stuff for small ruminants and sheep in particular. And there are a number of producers in our state which are, I don't know about 100% eliminating hay, but because of hay shortages and hay costs, are feeding less hay and replacing that with other feedstuffs, soy hulls being a good one. And so perhaps can replace a portion and can be a significant portion of the hay, but not entirely.
Okay, I think those are all the questions for right now.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. We want to get to the lambing stuff, so I'm going to move through a few things here pretty quickly. I appreciate your questions. They've been excellent. Real quickly on the abortion diseases, there's 4 of them primarily that we're concerned about in sheep, listed here on this slide. We can prevent those, number 1, through good flock biosecurity, and that means not bringing that in as we purchase sheep, and particularly as we purchase females, and keeping them isolated and away from the rest of our flock if at all possible. We do have vaccines available for 2 of the significant abortion diseases that affect sheep. Unfortunately, we don't have them for salmonella or toxoplasmosis. And so work with your local veterinarian in terms of your potential risk of your flock for these diseases. Many producers that have had an outbreak in the past have gone to a vaccination program, and that makes a lot of sense. Lots of ways to prevent that. Abortion diseases tend to impact our first-time lambers the most. One of the ways that we can prevent it is to definitely not feed on the ground, so we don't spread those organisms which might have been shed and could be picked up. If we do get ewes that abort, we want to make sure and do the best we can to collect that placenta, those dead or aborted feces, and dispose of them properly, and not, if we can all help it, not let other sheep be exposed to them. It's a good idea to work with your veterinarian to submit, if you get more than one, submit a sample to the lab so you can figure out what's going on, what the actual organism is, and you can take a proactive approach in terms of further presenting it. We want to isolate ewes which abort so they don't come in contact with our other pregnant ewes and potentially contaminate them. We do know through good research that feeding antibiotics, for example, the tetracyclines, can be effective, as can the feeding of rumensin. I would say that both of those are extra label use of those products. Neither one are approved for sheep to prevent abortion, and so you need to have a veterinary client-patient relationship and get a prescription. And of course, the feeding of antibiotics is going to require a VFD from your veterinarian to do that. So I'd highly encourage you to talk to your consulting veterinarian if you've got an interest in that for specifics. But there's data out there that supports the use of those to prevent abortions. Last thing on the pregnant ewe, we talked about pregnancy toxemia, quite common in sheep, as is milk fever and hypocalcemia. Pregnancy toxemia generally occurs in ewes that are carrying multiple births, lots of times in triplets. And simply what happens is that ewe doesn't have the physical capacity to ingest enough energy to meet the nutritional demands of her fastly growing fetuses, as well as maintain her metabolism. And it's a metabolic disease and an imbalance. Ketone bodies are formed. Those ewes get slow and sluggish. It tends to be a little bit gradual. You'll notice ewes starting to slow down in late pregnancy. These are generally the ewes, as I mentioned, that are carrying triplets and are quite large and go down. The treatment for that is fairly simple. We use propylene glycol to orally dose those ewes and get them energy. What they need is energy. And through supplemental energy, we usually can keep them going. The best thing that can happen is that they lamb. And once they lamb, then they snap out of it in a rapid fashion because they've obviously through lambing, they no longer have those growing fetuses which were causing the problem. Milk fever or hypocalcemia tends to come on a little quicker, tends to be rather sudden, and it's an imbalance of calcium. And so calcium supplementation in proper form is really important in late gestation, making sure that our forages and our feedstuffs have got supplemental calcium to meet that extra calcium demand we talked about earlier, making sure that our diet's fortified with calcium properly. Those ewes can go down. Symptomatically, they're similar, these two diseases, but their causes are quite different. So you need to get calcium solution into those ewes that have milk fever. Generally working with your veterinarian is probably the most logical thing to do that. And preventing it, as I mentioned, is certainly one of the things we want to pay attention to in late gestation ewe nutrition.
A couple quick questions before you move on. First is,
Yep.
if you're breeding on the star system, do you booster before each breeding or just once a year?
Booster what, Amanda?
It just says booster, so I'm not real sure. Maybe she'll answer when she hears it. She's on Facebook, so we'll see if she adds some comments to that. And
CD&T? To booster CD&T?
I'm guessing that's what it is, yes.
Okay. Quite honestly, I don't know the answer to that question with 100% certainty. My inclination would be is that you would likely want to booster those ewes in late gestation so that you get the immune response in the ewe, which then goes to the colostrum.
Okay, one other question from Jake. First off, thank you for your time. I'd like to know what kind of wormer you use. We have used the same wormer for years, dewormer, and I feel that we keep having the same parasite issues in lambs.
Okay, so short answer to a really complex question there, Jake, which is actually that question in and of itself could take up an hour webinar all by itself. But we do know that there is a lot of resistance that's out there in the sheep population to basically all the dewormers that we have. So I would guess that if you're using the same dewormer and it's not being effective, my guess is that potentially you have a population of worms in your flock that are resistant to the product that you're using, and so switching it to a different product of a different class would be a strategy I would attempt first to see if that resolves the problem.
And let me jump in on that too. Jake, we also have, we did have a webinar last summer on parasites. So that is on our Facebook page, archived, as well as our website. So I would encourage you to take some time and watch that too.
Good. So let's switch gears to the lambing part. These are the four main causes of lamb mortality. Most of those deaths occur in the first couple weeks of life, but that's stillborn, starvation, abortion, and pneumonia. And so anything we can do to prevent these obviously would be very positive. Okay, I think that starts by getting ready for the lambing season. And that first thing, think through what lambing supplies you might need. And I don't have these in any particular order, and certainly that list is not necessarily comprehensive. There are other things we could probably think about to add on here. I will say that I think the most important supply, and probably the one that will return you the most money, is listed first, and that's a stomach tube. To me, that's the shepherd's best friend at lambing season. Proper use of a stomach tube can save lots and lots of lambs and save you a lot of grief as a shepherd. And we'll visit about that here coming up in just a minute. Getting ready is really important, I think. I, for one, like many of you on board, I'm sure, have full-time jobs off the farm. And so knowing when my ewes are going to lamb is critical to me. For that reason, I synchronize my ewes. I use a marking harness on rams. I'm diligent about writing down mark dates so I know when to expect them, 145 days later. You can also ultrasound. If you've got that expertise in your region, a good veterinarian can give you a due date. They can count fetuses, and we can utilize that as well. But having a good expectation when those lambs are going to arrive is a big, big help. And I find it to be critical in my operation simply because I'm not there 24/7. I'm sitting at my office desk most of the time, but if I know when they're coming, I can schedule appropriately and make a quick trip home at noon or whatever the case might be. I always think about the question, how often to go to the lambing barn? And I think it's true for all of us. Lambing season is the most exciting time of year. And so the first 2 or 3 nights, when we know things are getting imminent, we get up in the middle of the night and we go. For me, that doesn't last very long. And so be efficient about that. I think a lot of that depends on how many sheep you have, what your facilities are, what's your environment, how cold is it, what are the risks, those kind of things, all very, very important. The last one on this slide I think is critical, and that's establishing a relationship with a veterinarian way prior to lambing season. Most of the time when we need a veterinarian, it's because we've got tangled up lambs in a ewe. We might need to do a C-section, or we need them to come out and pull a set of lambs. The time to establish a vet relationship is probably not on Sunday night at 10 o'clock when you've got a ewe having trouble. So visit with your veterinarian, your local veterinarian, patronize them a little bit, have them out, talk about your sheep flock, maybe go in and buy some of your supplies from them. Establish a relationship so that when you call them when you have trouble, you'll have a favorable outcome in terms of them helping you at lambing time. Okay. How about the lambing barn environment? And that will vary for all of us across the country. Here in our region of the country, very few of us have any heated facilities. It's simply not necessary for most of us. But what we all do have in common and should have in common is, number one, a dry environment. Number two, an environment that's draft-free, that's healthy for baby lambs, and is well ventilated. I like to use as a rule of thumb when we talk about temperature, while a 50 to 60 degree lambing room is really nice for us humans, it's not so healthy for sheep, based on the fact that the warmer it gets, the more moisture there is, there are more bugs and bacteria, viruses, and other organisms survive. The more of those organisms we have, the more challenges we're going to have with our flock health, and particularly health of baby lambs. So I like to use a good rule of thumb. I like it warm enough that the water buckets don't freeze, and that's probably as much for our comforts as it is for the sheep. But that's a really nice temperature range, because it tends to minimize organisms and bacteria and things that are going to cause us problems. Let's talk about the birthing process a little bit. As you all will recognize as shepherds, that no two ewes are alike. Some of those ewes start showing signs of labor 2 to 3 to 4 hours before they ever do anything. Other ewes are aggressive at the bunk and act like it's just another day, and half an hour later you go to the barn and they've had twins. And so lots of variation. Generally speaking, once a ewe goes into labor and those water bags are out, 45 to 60 minutes, that ewe should have done something productive relative to lambing, and that means having a lamb born. If it doesn't happen in that amount of time, we probably need to intervene. Once we can see the feet and that ewe's in active labor, somewhere between 50 and 30 minutes, we should see significant progress. If we don't see significant progress, or there's that ewes awful nervous and she's up and down and things don't seem right, we certainly want to intervene at that point, at least attempt to figure out what's going on. Multiple lambs are generally born within 30 minutes of each other. Oftentimes in mature ewes, it's much quicker than that. Ewe lambs, it might be 30 minutes. Again, a lot of ewe to ewe variation there, but those are kind of guidelines that we can think about as we think about a normal birthing process. Okay. One of the things I think to, if I were to give you any homework, and if you're not real familiar with normal versus abnormal presentations, a little bit of studying of this can be very helpful when it comes time to attempting to deliver lambs. Of course, these two presentations on the left are normal, head first with both front feet leading. If they've got twins or multiple births, they're going to be laying in the uterus, something like this. All these presentations on the right are abnormal, whether that's 1 foot back, 2 feet back, and a head only. A head back birth presentation, a breech presentation where we have just the rear end and no legs. Kind of a semi-breech presentation where they're coming backwards, but their back feet are coming out first. All those things, having a good understanding and knowledge of those various presentations is very helpful as we move into lambing season. So why do ewes have problems, or what causes dystocia or lambing problems? The two big ones really are, number one is failure to dilate. So the cervix simply doesn't dilate. There's been a lot of discussion in the sheep industry about ring womb, if you will. It's called other things. I'm not sure that we have an academic answer for what's happening there. But the ewe simply doesn't dilate and doesn't expand her uterus like she should for whatever reason. The biggest one is, or two bigger ones are simply a disproportion between the size of the lamb In other words, its head, its shoulders, its size is simply too big to comfortably fit through the pelvic opening. Okay? At times we have twins which are tangled up or coming the same time. And then we've got the abnormal presentations or position or posture, the malpresentation that we just talked about. Okay. Before we talk about helping use, as we get ready to start helping use, a few tips about examining them. Real important to be as sanitary as we can. And so again, this is some of the things to add to your supply list if you don't have them on there already. We want to make sure that U is well cleaned on her rear end. We can use warm soapy water, or we can use warm water with some chlorhexidine in it, which is a simple, very mild antiseptic. We want to make sure that our hands are clean, our arms are clean before we enter. If we've got OB sleeves, we want to use those. We want to be extremely liberal with our OB lube. If you don't have OB lube, you can use warm soapy water that's kind of slippery. That can work in substitute for OB lube. So as we go in that U, we want to put our hand in the shape of a natural wedge. In other words, go in fingers first, with those fingers kind of making a wedge or a triangle, if you will. And as we get in to help that U dilate, oftentimes when we need to explore a U or assist a U, she's not fully dilated. The reason for that is that probably that lamb hasn't been fully presented into the cervix and she hasn't fully dilated. So sometimes we have to spend time initially helping that U dilate. We can do that by simply expanding and contracting our hand in the cervix, and you will feel that start to expand and dilate as we put pressure on it. Okay. One thing I find that's helpful, if you can get your whole hand in, then make a fist, which helps kind of further expand the size of your hand, and that helps dilate. Okay. A couple things to remember as we help use and go into them. Number one, patience is a virtue. Be as patient and as relaxed as you can, and don't get in a hurry. I know that we all get anxious to get in there and try and save that lamb, but forcing ourselves in there and tearing the uterus or the cervix can have increased complications. Okay. Once we do that, our first job will be to figure out what's the presentation, position, and posture of the lamb. Okay. And so by presentation, what's coming first? Is it a head? Is it a leg? What's the position? Is it right side up? Is it upside down? And then what's the posture relative to normal posture, which is both front feet forward and head forward. So exploring that U and figuring out where we are. Once we kind of get a handle on that, then we can go and begin the process of assisting the U. Lots of tricks to this. Again, patience, number one, experience, number two. But to really be effective, we have to do the 3 Ps right, or have the 3 Ps understood relative to what we're dealing with. So exploring in there and figuring out where the head is, figuring out where the feet are at and which feet they are. Remember that front limbs, their joints flex in the same direction. If it's a hind limb, the 2 joints are going to flex in opposite directions. The hock and the ankle flex in opposite directions. That helps tell you if you've got a front leg or hock. The other thing to make sure that you know before you start attempting to pull that lamb is making sure that the feet you've identified and the head you've identified all belong to the same lamb and all connect to the same sheep. Okay? Particularly important in multiple births, and of course, as we're helping most ewes, we don't have a good idea how many are in there until we begin to look. As a general rule of thumb, work on her for 20 to 30 minutes. If you have not made significant progress and understand what needs to happen, you might want to seek professional help at that point. Newborn lamb processing. Okay, so generally, as a general recommendation, I recommend you allow ewes to lamb where they would like to lamb. And so if she beds down in a corner of the barn or along the hay bunk or wherever that might be in your drop area, allow that ewe to do her thing until she's finished. Moving that ewe when she's halfway through lambing postpones things. She's got to start all over in terms of figuring out where she's at. Moving her when she has one lamb before she has the second can do the same thing. So let that ewe lamb where she wants to, unless we need to intervene and move her elsewhere. Okay. Ensure that that ewe has colostrum by stripping her teats, and ensure that those lambs get colostrum shortly after birth. Most lambs ought to be up and about shortly after birth. Many of them are up in 10 to 15 minutes. Many of them are up in 5 minutes. But good, strong, healthy lambs at birth are going to be aggressive and begin to get up and seek mother's colostrum in relatively short order. If they don't, we're probably going to need to intervene. Iodine on the navels is a good idea to prevent navel ill. Do that as quick as possible after birth. And depending on what region of the country you live in, for example, in our region, we're going to give selenium and vitamin E in the form of BOC because of our selenium deficiencies. Others of you might live in regions of the country where other supplements at birth might be appropriate. Okay. Colostrum is important, of course, because it contains antibodies to all those diseases that ewe's exposed to. Not only diseases that we vaccinate for, like overeating, but also the naturally occurring pathogens and organisms in your environment. Those ewes have developed an immunity and an immune response to those various organisms, and they're going to pass that immune response from your environment to those lambs. Question often comes up is how much does a lamb need to drink? If we're going to tube a lamb, how much do we give it? The general rule of thumb is 10% of its body weight in the first 24 hours of life. So a 10-pound lamb would eat 16 ounces during the first 24 hours. Of course, they wouldn't do that all at one time. That would be through several nursings, but that's going to be their intake. As a general rule of thumb, 30 milliliters or 30 cc's is an ounce. Okay, so if we're going to tube a lamb, we're generally going to do 60 to 120 milliliters. That's 2 to 4 ounces initially, and then if we need to tube that lamb again, we'll come back in a few hours and give that lamb a couple more ounces until it responds and starts sucking on its own. Of course, monitoring that lamb in terms of where it's at relative to suckling reflex and its ability to nurse is critically important. Sources of colostrum, of course, colostrum from the ewe or the mother itself is the best, followed by another ewe in your flock. That other ewe in your flock might be in the form of frozen colostrum. I think it's always a good idea early in the lambing season, if you've got a ewe that's got plenty of colostrum, go ahead and milk her and freeze some. You can freeze them in a couple ounce increments in Ziploc bags and freeze them. Put them in an ice tray or an ice cube tray. There's all kinds of tricks to that, but if you get some frozen and in the bank, that can come in handy later when you might need it. Okay. If you can't get ewe colostrum, goat would be an acceptable replacement, as would cow. Neither one of those are as good as sheep colostrum, but if we don't have sheep colostrum, they're a lot better than Kool-Aid. And then, of course, there's artificial supplements out there as well that if we can't harvest some off of sheep, those can work if we need them to. Okay. I mentioned earlier that lamb hypothermia is a major leading cause of death in lambs, and that's simply lambs that get chilled or cold. Okay. Those lambs tend to be hunched up. They tend to be hollow. They tend to not have a suckling reflex. When we stick our finger in their mouth, they don't respond. They tend to be cold to the touch in the mouth. They might be down and out. They might be unresponsive. All those are signs of a hypothermic lamb. Technically, lamb's normal body temperature is 102 to 103. We consider anything under that to be hypothermic. So lambs that are slightly hypothermic are 100 to 101. Anything that's below 99 we consider severe. Okay. That can happen when lambs get chilled in the environment. Maybe they're born premature, maybe they're weak. Ultimately, it generally happens because they don't get energy intake and they don't get colostrum right away. and they don't have the body reserves to call upon to thermoregulate. Young lambs are not able to regulate their own body temperature. Even healthy baby lambs are not able to regulate their own body temperature for a significant amount of time unless they get colostrum and milk. So it's really important that they get up and nurse. So what do we do if they're hypothermic? Generally speaking, those lambs that aren't severely hypothermic, we can help them nurse if they've got the suckling reflex. We can tube those lambs with that 2 to 4 ounces as we talked about. The ones that are a challenge are the ones that are very cold. We go out and we find them, and they're not responsive. They're cold to the touch. They're alive, but they're not able to stand. If they can stand, and they're less than 99, we can go ahead and put them in a warming box until we can get their temperature to 99. And then give them colostrum or give them milk, whichever the case might be, stomach tube. The thing we don't want to do, and it's generally recommended not to tube lambs that are less than 99. The reason for that is they're not able to utilize that anyway, and that can be detrimental to their lifespan. If they can't stand or suckle, what we're going to do first is we're going to warm them up, and then we're going to tube feed them, okay, and get them up to a body temperature of 101. And once they reach that, they're generally going to have a little more spirit. There's lots of ways to warm up lambs. You see a warming box there in the picture. That's kind of a fancy way to do it. The floor of your pickup truck with the heater blowing on it. Take them in the house and put them next to the fireplace. Whatever it takes to get them in a warm environment. The first step would be to make sure and dry them off. And then the second step, get them in an environment where we can raise their body temperature. This is where a rectal thermometer comes in really handy, so we know exactly what we're dealing with relative to temperature. Okay. Some general rules of thumb relative to baby lamb management. Use your jug sparingly. Maybe general rule of thumb: 1 day for every lamb that's on the ewe. A lot of folks do longer than that, but that's not necessary. Provided those ewes and lambs are doing really well, they're probably able to be mixed in a smaller group. Keep a close monitor on them. Dock and castrate early are all good management tips as well. A few things relative to ewe and young lamb management. The first couple weeks of life are critical. That's when most of the lamb deaths occur, okay? And those issues generally arise. Why do we lose young lambs in the first couple weeks of life? One big reason is they starve to death. That can happen for one of 2 reasons. One is they get rejected by their mother, and so closely monitoring those lambs when we get them out of the jug and early on in life is critically important. If they look a little behind, they're a little gant, they're humped up, they're constantly bleeding for you, chances are that they've probably been rejected. The other thing that might cause that is if that ewe has mastitis. And so identification of ewe and her lambs is important. Pneumonia, of course, is a big culprit in young lambs. And so our environment and our barn and trying to keep it well bedded and dry and lack of moisture is really important. Lambs can be prone to scours. Lots of reasons for scours: E. coli, crypto, rotavirus, and salmonella. All those are viable candidates in terms of causing scours. Most are responsive to antibiotics. And then the ewe issues to watch for, of course, mastitis, as we've mentioned, which is infection of the udder. Okay, catching that early is really critical. Generally, a good sign a ewe has mastitis, that udder will be red and swollen. It'll be tender, so she might be reluctant to let her lambs nurse. It might be hot to the touch. She'll have a fever more often than not. And so she needs treatment right away with antibiotic therapy. The other thing to watch for in ewes is ORF, or sore mouth, which can develop on their teats. That too will could ultimately lead to mastitis, because if that's uncomfortable enough, she won't allow those lambs to nurse. with that, Amanda, I've got a few slides on orphan lambs, but I'm happy to entertain a few questions.
Okay.
We pushed up on an hour, and so I might
take some questions.
There's one question there that they're always told to get to 120, 102 before tubing. 99 is okay. Our rule of thumb that we've used here has always been 99 or greater. 102 would be normal.
Do you want me to go ahead and read the questions out loud? Or
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Do you feel that nasal sprays like Vectrin are as good as the weaker iodines that are now available on the market?
Could you repeat that, please, Amanda?
Sure. Do you feel that other nasal sprays like Vectrin are just as good as the weaker iodines that are now only available on the market?
Honestly, I don't have any basis to answer that question. So I don't know. I mean, I think the important thing is to the real important thing is to get at that early. If you wait till that lamb's quite old, that risk of infection has already been there. And so the quicker you can get that done with some sort of a thing that's going to be antibiotic in nature and kill any organisms that might have a chance to contaminate that navel, that's the key thing, and do it quickly, early.
How soon should one dock and castrate lambs?
A slide that we didn't get to. Generally, I recommend the earlier in life, the better. As a general recommendation, 2 days to a week for banding or for docking and castrating. I think that's particularly true with docking. The smaller the lambs are, the easier it is on the lamb, the easier it is on us. The quicker we get those lambs docked, the quicker they get healed. So as long as that lamb is off to a good start and he's healthy and doing well, the quicker we can get that done, the quicker it heals and the easier it is on us and the lamb. Castration, of course, that will vary depending on what your production system is. If we know we're going to castrate the lamb, the earlier in life we do that, the easier it is on us, the easier it is on the lamb. And so knowing that there's many of you which are seed stock producers, for example, here at school in our purebred flocks, we don't castrate anything until close to weaning time, until we have a chance to watch those lambs develop and have some data at hand to help us make culling decisions. And so we don't castrate anything at birth, but that's based on our production system and what we're doing with those sheep.
Do you recommend a nutrient drench shortly after birth for the lamb?
Do I recommend it?
Yes.
Not necessarily, but it's not a detrimental practice.
If a ewe has lost a lamb, how long after can you still attempt to graft a lamb onto her? A day, 3 days?
That's a great question. I don't know that I have a specific answer other than the quicker that's done, the better. From several respects. Number one, the quicker you can get a lamb to her, the stronger her mothering instincts are, and the more apt you are to be successful with her accepting another lamb. If you're going to wait any significant amount of time, a day is fine. If you wait 3 to 5 days to a week, that ewe's beginning to shut down in terms of her milk production, because sucking stimulates milk production. So if you've got a ewe in production that loses her lamb and you anticipate maybe having an orphan to put on her in a day or two, what you might want to do is milk her to help stimulate her milk production and keep her in milk. That would be my recommendation if you were going to do that.
What factors play a role in stillborn lambs?
So a number of factors can play a role. A couple of the classic abortion diseases can result in stillborn lambs where you'll have one lamb that's normal and healthy, and you'll have a stillborn which might not be normally developed. It might be mummified or something like that. That can be caused by some of the abortion organisms. Other reasons for stillborns, perhaps there's an unknown complication during the birthing process that for whatever reason, that lamb lost its lifeline for oxygen in the uterus during the birthing process too early, and is simply born dead. That's often what happens. Exactly why that happens, I'm not sure we have a total understanding, but that's why it's not unusual. And one of the risks that we have, if you do have complications, we want to make sure we get those addressed in a timely fashion, because the lamb that's actually being born difficulty, we want to save that lamb, obviously, but the quicker we get that lamb out, regardless of its outcome, if there's multiple births, the longer they're in there, the increased chance we have of losing the additional fetuses as well. So that can happen.
What is a good time period to ultrasound for fetal count?
Generally, I think most veterinarians would like to do that somewhere between 40 and 60 days. Perhaps a little bit earlier than that. If you wait too long, the challenge becomes as those fetuses get too big that you physically, if the fetuses get too big, it's difficult to count them because you can't manipulate around with ultrasound to figure out where they're all at, and they're difficult to count. So you want to get at them when there's enough age that you can clearly define how many fetuses they are and be able to visualize them all and to count them.
At what age do you wean lambs?
That will depend on your production system. If you've got a relatively intense production system where you're looking for rapid early growth and going to sell those lambs as quick as you can get them grown out into the marketplace, 60 to 70 days is a good weaning time. Conversely, we've got production systems here, actually at our unit here at school, that we're not weaning till 90 plus days. Those lambs are born later in the spring. Ewes and lambs run on grass. We don't get in a big hurry to wean those lambs. As milk production shuts down in the ewes, those lambs are grazing anyway. And so they're weaned at a later age. So it depends on your production system and what you'd like to do.
Is a ewe and lamb pellet a good source for added energy for late gestation?
A ewe and lamb pellet?
Yeah, that's what, ewe and lamb pellet.
Okay. So a commercial supplement, you would want to look at and find out what the analysis of that particular feed stuff is. Its energy level, which should be on the feed tag, as well as its level of protein. My guess is if it's a commercially available pellet of some sort, it's got some added energy and protein to it, but the exact quantity will vary based on manufacturer and what the ingredients of that product are.
What do you recommend for feeding late gestation ewes?
Well, generally, that will depend on what your available feedstuffs are. I can answer that for our production systems here. That's generally consists of hay, and then an energy supplement, which is corn-based, and primarily corn. So they're going to get, their intake of hay, kind of medium to a little above average hay in that 55 TDN range, along with a pound or two of supplemental energy in the form of corn or a corn product like corn gluten feed. and then of course the added minerals and vitamins that we talked about.
One comment for the nutrition component. We did have a webinar last fall on nutrition prior to lambing in the beginning of lactation, and that webinar is archived on our Facebook page and on our website too. So for anybody who wants to learn a little more in detailed information, you can check that out. What can you use to get lambs interested in creep feed?
That's a great question. So from a real simple answer standpoint, start lambs on creep, give them anything they'll eat. Generally speaking, that would include whatever you're feeding the ewes, because as those lambs get interested in eating, the first thing they're going to do is go to the bunk and nibble with the ewes. So make sure you include some of the feed that you're feeding the ewes. As you very first introduce creep feed, lambs tend to like straight soybean meal, and so a little bit of that. Some of anything of the commercially available creep feeds, particularly those that are fortified with palatability components like molasses and other things, are excellent in terms of getting those lambs interested in feed. So the key thing at the very beginning is getting them to eat and start to nibble, learn where the creep is. As they begin to eat some, then you can start to put them on a ration that you're interested in adjusting them to. So experiment, give them lots of different choices and see what they like.
Okay, just quickly, I do have a poll going for those of you that are joining us via Zoom that you can rate the webinar as we kind of finish up questions here. Can they have soy meal in late gestation? I'm guessing can use soybean meal maybe in late gestation?
Yes.
Do you know any way of getting funding for starting a farm? I'm guessing maybe they're thinking about grant programs. I don't know of any.
No, you might visit your local farm service agency and ask if they've got any opportunities there.
Question on how do you synchronize ewes? I don't know that we talked about that at all, but maybe you can touch on that just briefly.
In season or out of season?
I'm guessing in season based on who had asked the question.
Okay, so one method that's commonly used is using CEDARs, the intervaginal progesterone device, putting those CEDARs in somewhere between 12 to 14 days, and then removing those CEDARs, and those ewes will be in heat 24 to 48 hours later.
Should creep feed include a medicated feed?
So by medicated, generally speaking, yes. And for most of us and in most of our production systems, that medication would include a coccidiostat for the prevention of coccidia.
Okay.
And that's probably going to be Decox or Bovatec.
Someone jumped in. If you have time, they would like to hear how to synchronize ewes out of season as well.
So very similar protocol. The difference being that in season we're using that progesterone CEDAR to synchronize ewes which are already cycling. So they're already cycling. All we're trying to do is put those cycles in sync. And so we leave them in for most of the cycle to allow all those ewes to, when we pull the CEDAR, they're all going to be at the same point in time. Okay. Out of the season, what our interest is in jump starting the estrus cycle, because most of those ewes are not cycling. That's actually what the CEDAR is designed for and approved for. And so a 5-day CEDAR is what the label is. So insertion of a 5-day CEDAR, pull the CEDAR, and those ewes should respond 24 to 48 hours. A couple of key things to using those. It's real important that those ewes be isolated from the ram prior to the breeding season. And when we say isolation, that means sight, sound, smell. So on a different farm, the ram should be far, far away. Fence line is not considered isolated because we want to additionally utilize that ram effect to help them synchronize.
In a selenium deficient area, should you give lambs a selenium gel once they're born, even though you have supplemented the ewes during pregnancy?
We generally recommend to also give lambs supplemental selenium in our area, along with those ewes being supplemented, yes. So at birth, yes, as an insurance against white muscle disease.
Is there any link between lambing ease and success and the amount of exercise they receive? For example, is there any difference in lambing success among ewes that are in lambing jugs for an extended period of time versus those walking to various placements of feed and forage around the pasture?
Amanda, I don't know of any. I'm unaware of any research or any studies that have evaluated that. I think from a general ewe health standpoint, that exercise is healthy, helps maintain, no different than any other species or humans. If we force them to be lethargic, they have less energy, and potentially they aren't as effective at lambing time. That said, I can't point to any concrete evidence that would directly compare those.
Okay. Do you recommend a heat lamp for newborn lambs in an extremely cold weather or temperature?
Well, to be honest, I'm not a big fan of heat lamps because I personally think they may have cost us more barn fires than they've saved lambs. A heat lamp can be an effective tool to warm a chilled lamb. I think the important thing when you use a heat lamp is to use it properly to make sure that that thing is safe, that it's properly enclosed, and it's shielded against the opportunity for that ewe to get into it or for it to break or to cause a fire. Provided all that's done, they're fine. But generally speaking, once those lambs are born and they're dry and they're belly full of colostrum and they're off to a good start, unless we've got severe environmental conditions, most of them don't need a heat lamp.
Okay.
Now, the exception to that's the lamb that's cold or weak or not doing well. That's the exception.
Okay. I'm just looking here to see if there's any other questions I missed. I think we're getting them all answered. Someone has asked if the slides are going to be available after the presentation. Is that something that I can get a copy of those and post them with the archived webinar?
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. What kind of bedding should you consider to use for a new lamb and lambing? What kind of bedding should you use?
Oh, I think any bedding that will maintain a dry environment for you. So what you want that bedding to be absorptive, so it wicks up moisture that might be there. So straw, shavings. I know of folks that have used corn stalks, folks that have used newspaper, had access to shredded newspaper they've used. All those things can work fine.
Would you
as
say
long as they're absorptive of fluids and help maintain a dry environment?
Would you say it's a good idea to move week-old lambs into a lean-to area?
Well, providing shelter, yes.
I think, anybody else have any questions? Lots of great questions tonight. I think that might be it. Well, thank you so very much for joining us tonight, everybody who's on Facebook and Zoom. Thank you to Scott for spending your evening with us tonight to share your knowledge, and hopefully everybody picked up a few tips for the upcoming lambing season.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.